This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Thank you everyone for coming for this momentous event for the Los Angeles community. I first want to say thank you to Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli from the Rav, the Marad Asra of Kehilat B'nai Torah here in Los Angeles, Pico and Robertson, opening up his shul and hosting Rabbi Glatstein, Shlita, who has had actually a tremendous influence on my life. And I have the schus to have been introduced to him about 8 years ago. I was living in Crown Heights, commuting to Woodbridge, New Jersey, about an hour each way, and I needed to spend my time, worthwhile. So I tuned into Torah Anytime. I randomly, played one of his shiurim, and I was mesmerized by the level of detail that every single step he makes in the shiur, it's source-based, and it's so clear and obvious to anyone who listens to his shiurim, the level and amount of time he prepares each shiur. I had an hour in the car. I'm sure it took him 10 hours to prepare. I felt like I was sitting in a bet midrash in the Mir Yeshiva with so much information, and I just so much appreciated it. After many years, I used to print out the Mar Mekomot, and I would print it out. Anyone who knows me, he knows in my suit pocket I have his Mar Mekomot. Every Shabbat I would review them. At my sister's wedding, I actually met the Rav of the Chassan, and I asked him, do you post any shiurim online? He says, no, absolutely not. I believe in making a personal relationship with people. When you post it online, who knows who listens? It's very, who knows what kind of impact you make on people. I thought to myself, wow. I shared this with my wife. She said also, that's not true. Look at the relationship you have with Rabbi Glatstein. Every time you have a question, an insight to one of his shiurim, you email him, you message him, and he immediately gets back to you. You have a kesher with him. I'm like, I think he's a very unique person that can actually, connect to everybody. At one of the fundraisers of his building, he had a Chabadnik, he has Hasidim, he has Farabim, he has Ashkenazim. They all appreciate and listen to a shiurim. I think that in itself says all you need to know about a Rav like that. I want to thank some of the sponsors. We had Adas Torah, right here in Pico. We had Anshe Emet as well. We had also members from the Hancock Park community, and Israel of Hancock Park. We had the Mishmar, Los Angeles Mishmar. And I also want to thank my wife, my dear wife, who's put up with me. She's in her 9th month pregnant. And it was very difficult, to say the least. I'm not home, I'm helping with the Shabbaton. And Be'emet, it's a Mesirut Nefesh, and I want to say thank you to her, because I really appreciate everything she's done and giving me the opportunity to have that relationship with Rabbi Glatstein. And without further ado, I want to invite Rabbi Glatstein to share with us some words of Chizuk in Yonah Diyoma before Rosh Hashanah. Actually, sorry, Rabbi Yisrael, you should come to a few words. Yes, thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and Bruchim Habayim. It is a true honor to host and be achsanya to the Torah. Of any sort of Torah that's serious and impactful, it is specifically an honor to have someone that is very unique in more than one way. You look up, and this is again, I mentioned this earlier, that I've been introduced to him almost a year now. The first time was right before Sukkot of last year, when Yaakov Tubi gave me the first sefer of Magid Arakia on Bereshit, and said, Rabbi, you have to get to know this person, Rabbi Glatstein. I was like, who's Rabbi Glatstein? And honestly, in the short time that I've gotten to know him, and especially since the moment that we decided together with Rabbi Yaakov that we're bringing Rabbi Glatstein in, I've also listened to some of the audios that he has. You look at Torah Anytime, and you have nearly staggering number of almost 8,000 shiurim. This is far that the first one afterwards is thousands lower. And that shows a certain consistency that the person has to have, even though there has been, 8, 9, 10 years on Torah Anytime, but still having that many shiurim needs a certain consistency. And you see the organized Marei Mekomot, the source sheets that he always has, very well researched, very organized, put together very well, and the delivery, both if you read the Sfarim or you listen to the Shiurim, there's a certain sense of genuine Torah that emanates from the Shiurim, the talks that Rabbi Glatstein has, and it's something very special that you don't find necessarily every day, and I feel an honor to have become friends with him. Now I have his cell phone number. We're going to make a chavruta over the phone, and it's great to. We actually walked in on Pico together, and people said, "You guys are twins." Like, yeah, I didn't know I'm so good looking, but Baruch Hashem. So it's an honor to have Rabbi Glatstein with us. The Gemara says in Masachet Brachot Daf Membet, the Gemara says, "Techev Talmidei Chachamim bracha." When you have Talmidei Chachamim, you host the Torah, you become Machzaniah, the Torah, bracha comes with it. The actual bracha is the Torah that you have brought to the community, and it's an honor and privilege and pleasure to call upon Rabbi Glatstein to address us with some divrei chizuk for Elu.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really touched and humbled to have spent such a beautiful Shabbos here in this Kehilat B'nai Torah. And in only a short amount of time, Rabbi Yisraeli has transformed this makom into one of the premier makomot HaTorah in all of Los Angeles. And it's really a pleasure to get to know my twin a little bit better. We were separated at birth, and the reunion has really been touching. And we wish the Rav continued Hatzlacha here, L'Hagdil Torah L'Hadira, with his Kehila, with all his Talmidim, with the entire community for many happy and healthy years. I'm particularly touched by my dear friend Rabbi Yaakov Tubi, who made this whole weekend happen. I think the first time I realized how connected Yaakov was to the Shurim is when I saw he sent me a video of his notebook of the Marei Mekomot, and it looks something like, I don't know, a law journal or some kind of document from in Windsor Castle. When they coronated King Charles, they gave him that thing, something like that, to sign or something. But I appreciate that Yaakov appreciates the Shiurim, and my admiration and love to him is mutual, and we wish him and his mishpacha and his wife, Be'ezus Hashem, b'shah tov u'matzlachas, a happy and healthy progeny, b'siyata d'shmaya, banu v'nei banu moiskim atar v'mitzvos, al Yisrael shalom, amen, ken yehi ratzayin. This time of year, perhaps more than any other time, is a time of memories. We're going to have Zichronos in the Tfilos of Rosh Hashanah. We're going to say Yizkar on Yom HaKippurim. We're going to say Zachreinu L'chaim, remember us for life. And for me personally, the season of Yomim Noraim is a time of vivid memories, a time when the floodgates of memory are open wide. Tavshin Pei Beis has been a year of great bracha for me and my family, Baruch Hashem. But it was also a very difficult year for my family. First, we completed a year of mourning for my revered grandfather, Harav Mordechai Leib Glatstein, Zechatzak Levracha, who passed away in his 106th year. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was in Auschwitz. He was in Dachau. He was in the crematoria, yanked out in the last second. He knew Rav Menachem Zemba. He was a student of Rav Menachem Zemba. He knew the Gerer Rebbe before the war. He survived concentration camp. He survived Nazis, Germans. He was a Rav in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 70 years. We could apply to him very aptly, Tzaddik Yisoid Olam. He was the pillar of the universe. And then shortly after, we completed the year of mourning for my other grandfather, my mother's father, Reb Shimon Yoshua Hirschfang, who has a very different background. He was born in America. He grew up in the Bronx in the 1930s during the Great Depression. He grew up in poverty when the whole family had to sleep in one bed because they couldn't afford more in a tenement apartment. You have to know, in the 30s in the Bronx, there were 600,000 Jews, but only 600 boys went to yeshiva. You understand what that means? 600,000 Jews and only 600 boys went to yeshiva. The assimilation rate was astronomical, and he had to overcome many hurdles and challenges to remain an Erlich Hayid. He came to Flatbush. He's one of the founders of Rabbi Hillel David Shul, one of the renowned shuls in Flatbush. As a young adult, he lost hearing in one ear, which meant he lost his balance, but he always persevered, and he would sort of stagger from Beis HaKnesses to Beis HaKnesses, collecting money for Aniyei Eretz Yisrael. Anyone who has ever heard me speak knows how often I spoke about my grandfathers and how much they meant to me. And I tell you something, when my grandfathers were alive, when my grandparents were alive, it gave me a sense of security. They were my foundation, my bedrock. And to tell you the truth, it made me feel like a kid. You have parents, you have grandparents. And with the loss of grandparents, your security is shattered. You feel you're a step closer. The haunting words of the Yerushalmi in Moed Katan became much more poignant. The Yerushalmi in Moed Katan says that a family is like a mound of stones. It's very secure. That is, when they're all present, but as soon as you take one out, all the stones are wobbly. There's no security. And thinking about all the memories and what the loss of my grandparents means to me. I mean, my grandparents were some of the most profound influences in my entire life. And the following Gemara, Masechta Tainis, comes to mind. The Gemara tells us the story of Choni Hamagel, Choni the circle maker. And he was once walking on the road and he sees a guy planting a carob tree, charuven. Now, why in the world somebody would eat a carob is one of the great mysteries of life. I mean, do you eat the table? You don't eat the table. Why would somebody eat a carob? But the guy was planting buxer, and Choni says to the guy, "You're planting a buxer tree?" I mean, I understand that I'm here in LA for one day. I'm mesmerized by the trees. I was asking Reuven, thank you very much for taking me around. What is that Italian cypress, right? I called the landscaper in New York. How do I get one of those? They said in New York, 18 feet maximum, and you can't get Italian cypress. They have like something that looks like. I already contacted. But a buxer tree, how long does it take to plant a buxer tree? He said 70 years. So Choni said, "You're going to be around for 70 years?" And the man responded, "Hai gavra alma b'charuva ashkachte." I came to a world with a carob tree in it. Ki hechi deshasli li avasi, shasli nami levroi. If my grandfather planted a carob tree for me, then I need to do the same for future generations. And this is the feeling that I have. That if we have been fortunate to have been the beneficiaries of parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, who were moiser nefesh, they had great sacrifice to observe the Torah in very trying times so that we can be here today, then it is our responsibility, it is our achrayus, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we do the same for future generations. My grandfather, he knew his grandfather. His grandfather was a Rav in the city of Linschitz when the Malbim sat in the city of Linschitz and wrote the Parsha Malbim. My grandfather's grandfather knew the Malbim. So I looked at my grandfather, he took me back 160 years. Are we prepared to do the same and have the same impact on our children and grandchildren? Let me start with one of my favorite all-time stories. I'm a big fan of Rabbi Beryl Wein, who's a very interesting personality. He was a Rav, he is a Rav, Rosh Yeshiva, historian, producer. I had the privilege to meet him again recently. And he often tells over the story of when he was 11 years old in 1946, and he was a Ben Yachid, and his father says, Beryl, we're going now to the airport, Chicago Midway Airport. He says, Dad, who's in the airport? He says, a great rabbi is coming to the airport. Who's the rabbi? Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, chief rabbi of Palestine. Rabbi Herzog was an amazing personality, a very aristocratic personality. He has great teshuvos, and he would wear a shiny top hat. He would hold a cane in one hand, a Tanakh in the other, and he lit from the plane, and all the balabatim and all the yeshiva students from the Skokie yeshiva came to greet him, 200 boys in all, and they escort Rabbi Herzog to the great shul, and Rav Herzog gave a pilpul in Yiddish for 45 minutes, and then when he was done, he turns to the young men. He says, young men, I would like to have a word with you. And he speaks to them in English. By the way, Rabbi Herzog was a rabbi in Dublin, so he spoke with a slight Irish brogue. And he said, I want you to know, men, that I just came back from a meeting with Pope Pius XII. And I had with me the names of 10,000 Jewish boys and girls who during the Holocaust, they were given to monasteries, to priests, to churches, because parents didn't think they would ever survive and they didn't think their children would survive. So they deposited their children at the doorstep of monasteries. He had their names, their parents' names, their original addresses. And he said, Pope, they're our children. Now you're kidnapping them. Give them back. Give us back our children. And the Pope flatly refused. The Pope slams the door in Rabbi Herzog's face. He says, all of these children have been baptized. According to our religion, once a child has been baptized, they can never be given back to any other religion. The children are ours. Rabbi Herzog pleaded, but to no avail. And he left the Vatican, Raycum, empty-handed. And Rabbi Herzog, standing there in Chicago, is so overcome with emotion that this great tzaddik, this great Goin, he breaks down on the lectern and he weeps bitterly. Says, Rabbi Wein, I was never so frightened in my entire life. And then the rabbi defiantly lifts his head, and his head is red like a lion. And he roars out to the crowd, young men, there's nothing I could do for those 10,000 children. They're lost forever. But what are you going to do for the future of the Jewish people? That was the challenge Rabbi Herzog gave these 200 young boys in 1946. And Rabbi Wein writes, we filed by Rabbi Herzog, and he shook each one of our hands, and he looked at us in the eye, and he said, did you hear what I said? Remember what I said. What will you do for the future of the Jewish people? And Rabbi Wein writes that many times in his life, he's discouraged, he's despondent, he's worn out, he's tired. But then he hears Rabbi Herzog's cry ringing in his ears. What will you do for the future of the Jewish people? And that strengthens him, that challenges him, and that has shaped many decisions in his life. And that's a question, perhaps the most important question each one of us has to ask ourselves. What are we going to do for the future of the Jewish people? And for many of us, the most important contribution we will make to Klal Yisrael is the influence we will have on our children and our grandchildren. So I want to share with you a perspective. What is the power of the influence one can have on their children and grandchildren? I want to share with you the comments of the Sefarno. The greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu is well known. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest man who ever lived. He was the greatest prophet. V'loikam navi b'Yisrael k'Moshe. He took us out of Mitzrayim. He gave us the Torah. He gave us breakfast. He gave us lunch. He gave us dinner for 40 years. He brought us to the precipice of Eretz Yisrael. He was the most humble man who ever lived. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, the same way he was the most humble man who ever lived, he likewise excelled in every imaginable character trait. Chazal say, Moshe shakol keneged shishim riboy shel Yisrael. Here's the $1 million question. What was his secret? What's the nakuda? Can we pinpoint the reason Moshe was the greatest person who ever lived is because of what? Was it his hasmada, his yirashamayim? What was the cause of it? Another interesting question. Moshe Rabbeinu's family, Miriam and Aaron, not too shabby. Not too shabby. I mean, whoever their parents were, did a pretty good job. Moshe, Kohen Gadol, Miriam Hanaviah, that's pretty good. That's an all-star lineup over there. What was it about Yocheved and Amram that they were able to produce these 3 children? Listen to a Svarno. Says a Svarno in Parshas Va'era. He says an amazing chiddush. Levi herich yamim al kulam. Levi outlived all the other Shvatim. Yosef only lived 110 years. Levi lived 137 years. So not only did Levi teach his son, Levi taught his grandson. Says the Svarno, and Kahas lived long. So Kahas not only taught Amram, Kahas taught Moshe, and Amram taught Moshe. Says the Svarno, Levi herich yamim al kulam, gidel es bnei banav lahavin ulahayros. Be'oifen sheyatsu mehem Moshe, Aaron, Miriam. You know why Moshe was greater than anyone in Klal Yisrael? Because he was the lucky beneficiary of seeing his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father. And our Rosh Hashiva of Henoch Libo Zeretzak Baruch brought out from the Sfarno, we see from here that the primary cause of Moshe Rabbeinu's greatness was the fact that he was able to gain not only from parents, but from grandparents and from great-grandparents. In other words, this idea that the liberals say it takes a village to raise a child, it doesn't take a village. It takes parents. It takes a grandparents. It takes great-grandparents. So you say, very good. What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, if you have a great-grandfather like Levi and a grandfather like Kahas, then you could produce a family like that. But that has no bearing on this generation. What does that have to do with our generation? So there's another Sfarno. The Sfarno says in Parshas Mishpatim on the words, Es mispar yamecha amale, I will fill your days. The Sfarno says, this is the great bracha of arichas yamim, of long life. Says the Sfarno, and what's the advantage of long life? What's the benefit of long life? Says the Sfarno, so you could teach your children and your grandchildren, maybe further. And then you too, says the Sfarno, ba'oifen she'kara be'inyan Levi, Kahas, ve'amram. Says the Sfarno, this wasn't an isolated bracha. This is a bracha that God promises and makes available in all times. That somebody who is connected to the Torah can now be the beneficiary of teaching children, grandchildren, great-children, and creating great generations. So if you were fortunate enough to come into this world, do you know how your great-grandparents sacrificed that you should be here today? Do you know how your grandparents sacrificed that you should be here today? Are you willing to do the same for your future generations? People say, when I become 70, 80, 90, I'm going to go down to Florida, and I'm going to retire, and I'm going to take it easy. Because after all, my kids are out of the house. That's the dream. No, those are the most important years of life. That's when you have the greatest influence. That's when your progeny may start listening to you. You know what they say, why grandparents love their grandchildren so much. Because they have a common enemy, right? But let's try to study and focus. What exactly is the power of the influence of a father and a mother? Why does a father and a mother have such a strong influence on their children? Is it because they love their children so much and their children love them so much, so they're more receptive to the parent? What exactly is the influence of a father and mother? So I want to share with you a personal idea. This is a phenomenon that I've observed over the last couple of years of speaking. So I could give a 45-minute shiur, an hour shiur, and it's a prepared talk. I know where I'm going. I know the content. I know the source material. And sometimes I'll mention something completely agavorcha with no intention to mention. It just happens to slip in. And it's not even related to the subject matter. I'll give you an example. So I once was invited to speak in Muncie to a girls' seminary. And I figure, I'm speaking to a girls' seminary. You want to establish some connection with the audience so that they listen to what you have to say. So it happens to be that the night before, I sent my daughter to seminary. And that was a Sunday night. The Friday night before I sent my daughter to seminary, I'm a very emotional guy. So I was standing there at the Shabbos table, and my daughter is there, and I'm thinking, I'm not going to see her for the whole year. She's going to be in Israel. And it was just so painful to me, it was so emotional to me. I just started crying in the middle of Kiddush. I could not get through it. I mean, don't think of me any less. That's just the reality, I'm very emotional. So I told these seminary girls, I just sent my daughter to seminary, and it was very emotional for me, and I was crying. And then I gave the shiur. This is the shiur I gave this morning about, the Tchias HaMesim and TESHUVA. And sure enough, after the shiur, and this had nothing to do with the shiur. So one girl comes over and says, that was such a powerful shiur, and that you cried that your daughter went to seminary. I wish somebody would have cried when I went to seminary. And, by the way, that itself is a very telling statement. And I'm thinking to myself, why is that what you remember from what I spoke about? That wasn't the subject of the shiur. I gave a 45-minute shiur about teshuva. Was my shiur so completely incomprehensible, and you didn't get one thing from what I said, that the only thing that you remember from my shiur is the fact that I made the mistake to mention that I cried before I sent my kid to seminary? But that's exactly the point. Because the 45-minute talk was a prepared talk. It's something that I organized. It's something that I said. It's something that I prepared. But it wasn't me, it was what I was saying. But when I was telling them something, agavurcha mesiach lefi tumai, that was dvarim hayotzim min alev, that was me. And people are not really listening to what you're saying, they're looking at who you are. Something that you happen to slip in, something that you didn't mean to say, something that you said agavurcha, mesiach lefi tumai, in a certain sense is much more powerful than anything you're ever going to say. People say, I want to teach my kids about Lashon Hara. Okay, I'm going to take out the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim says that Lashon Hara is a bad thing to do. What, you think your kids are paying attention to something you're reading? That's not who you are. You're just saying words. Says the Alshich, you want to influence your children? You want to have an effect on your children? Vishinantam levanecha, you want to teach your children? Says the Alshich HaKadosh, V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anoichi mitzavcha hayoim al levavecha, when it's on your heart. Vishinantam levanecha, then you can teach it to your children. If you feel it, if it's inside of you, if it's coursing through your veins, you could give it over to your children. But if you're just saying words, it will hit your kid's eardrum and bounce off. Very often it's the unprepared, unrehearsed, off-the-cuff remark that is much more impactful than something you happen to put together and set over. It's very interesting. In halacha, there's a certain credibility of Mesiach Lefi Tumai than, in terms of testimony, than any remark that somebody would make. Halachically, only the testimony of two Jewish people, Jewish males, is admissible in a court of Jewish law. If one man comes in, we ignore it. If a Gentile comes in, it has no credibility. But look in Even HaEzer, Siman Yud Zayin, Sif Yud Daled. If a Gentile is Mesiach Lefi Tumai in the course of conversation, happens to mention, it's such a shame, I was walking down the street and I passed by Yankel's house, and Yankel, the guy says, Tony says Yankel's not here anymore, he passed away last week. His wife could go remarry. Why? We don't have two witnesses that Yankel died. Because the Gentile it slipped out of his mouth, Yankel's dead. So that has credibility, that has authenticity, that is genuine, and you could take it to the bank. Mesiach Lefi Tumai, of one aid. Now it's an amazing thing. If, let's say, the Gentile heard two Jews discussing Yankel, is Yankel alive, Yankel dead, and the Gentile comes in and says, Yankel's not alive anymore, we don't believe him, because he intended to say that. And if you ask the Gentile, what is Yankel's status, and the Gentile responds, we can't trust him. And if the Gentile is Yankel's enemy, we can't trust him. But if there's no reason, if it was just a random, off-the-cuff remark that even a Gentile makes, that so-and-so is not alive, if all the conditions are met, this is considered one of the most powerful statements of evidence, Mesiach Lefi Tumai. And that is basically a very strong part of the influence of a parent. Because the Rebbe could put on the blackboard, do A, do B, don't do C, and nobody's listening to a word that anybody says. It could be the biggest rabbi. Okay, a little bit. If you have a real chashuva rabbi like Rabbi Zrei, everybody's all ears, but in general, nobody's paying attention to what people say. People are influenced by who you are. And your children see one Mesiach Lefi Tumai after another, one off-the-cuff remark after the other. What's your attitude toward Torah? What's your attitude toward Tznius? What's your attitude toward Rabbanim? And that is one of the most powerful influences in our life. Push comes to shove, the trajectory of a child will be determined by the images in the child's mind of the father and mother. Think about Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef's a young man. Yosef is a handsome man. He's 30 years old. He's in Egypt. And every single day, Eishes Potiphera, she's wearing him down, she's wearing him down, she's wearing him down. Uv'chol yom v'yom. And the Chazal say, Vayehi kahayom hazeh, it was on a certain day. It was the holiday. And her husband went off to the Beis Tiflos. And she's alone in the house. She says she's sick. And she makes an advance to Yosef. And she was very tempting. And Chazal described very graphically and vividly what a great challenge it was to Yosef. And don't think Yosef just jumped out the window and no. The Gemara in Soita says Yosef was about to do it. And the Gemara gets even more graphic. Ayin Sham. How close Yosef was to Oisai Maisa. And in the last moment, he didn't do it. What stopped him? A Musar Shmuz he once heard in Yeshiva? Yiras Shamayim? What stopped Yosef? Basa de yuknoi shel aviv v'niras aloi b'chaloin. The image of his father. The picture of his father. That's something we all have to understand and recognize. That push comes to shove. One of the most powerful influences in our children's life is what picture do our children have of us? Oh, Dad. Dad. Dad is always on the phone. He always has the phone. Everywhere. No matter what. Mom's always on the phone. Mom's always shopping. Mom's always buying shoes. Dad's always in front of the big screen. Dad's always in front of a sefer. Dad takes his mitzvah seriously. When Dad says Berachas Hamazon, it's something important to him. When somebody says, could you, and Dad's benching, he doesn't go, No, you can't talk to him when he's benching. It's important to him. The story goes that the great Goin, the Nachal Eshkol, there was a family in his community where one of the boys was kidnapped and taken to a monastery. And the parents could not rescue the child. They cannot get their kid out of the monastery. And they tried with the legal measures, and they pled to the judge, and they couldn't rescue the child. And years gone by. The boy was kidnapped at age 4. He's now 10 years old. And there was a new judge, so they petitioned again, and the judge was a little bit more sympathetic. And the judge says, listen, look, I hear what you're saying. You haven't seen your kid in 6 years. I see the documentation. You used to have a kid. And this kid is now 10 years old. But the church says this kid has always been there. So I think this is fair, the judge says. We're going to give you 5 minutes with the child. If in 5 minutes you could convince the child to come home with you, then he's your child. But if you can't wrestle him free in 5 minutes, you can't convince him in 5 minutes, Sham tehei dirasai, sham tehei misasai, sham tehei kfurasai, the kid's going to remain in the monastery. So the parents had some degree of hope, but they were very anxious. What can you do in 5 minutes? So the great Goy in the Nachal Eshkol said, okay, I'm going to accompany you. And the fateful day came, and the parents head into the monastery, and they turn around, and there the great Goy in the Nachal Eshkol was there. And he's dressed in white, his white kittel for Yom Kippur, and he's wearing his white yarmulke. And the parents are wondering, what exactly is this rabbi going to do? And they're standing face to face with their child. The parents don't even know what to say. They turn to the rabbi. The rabbi doesn't say a word. The rabbi starts to hum a tune. Kahayel nidrei v'asarei. He starts humming the Kol Nidrei. And the boy is like frozen, like in a trance, like, what world did he hear that tune in? And the parents are looking expectantly at the child, and like time is frozen. How will the child react? And there are only 2 minutes left. And the rabbi says to the child, do you want to come back with us and get this world and the world to come? Or do you want to stay here forever? And the boy, like jumping out of a dream, jumps to his parents. He says, get me out of here. Take me to the shul that I heard this tune. I don't want to stay here another minute. It was that image, it was that surah of a Yom Kippur tune that made the impact on the child. The wicked Menashe served every single idol in all of Eretz Yisrael. He put idolatry throughout the land, and in the end of his days, they took Menashe, they put him in a pot, and they were cooking him. And Menashe didn't know what to do, so Menashe, in the deep recesses of his mind, what inspired Menashe to do tshuva? He said, when I was a young boy, I remember my father read the pasuk, Batsar lecha umitzaucha kol hadvarim ha'ileh, when you're in distress and you find yourself in difficulty, V'shavta ad Hashem lekecha, you could return to Hashem. It was the verse, it was the pasuk that his father taught him when he was a little boy. That's what turned his life around. This is the koyach that a parent has to create vivid memories in the mind of the child. That the child should remember how my father davens on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. How do you make Kiddush Friday night? That image should be seared onto the heart of the child. How do you say a Shechiyanu on a Yom Tov? How do you fulfill a mitzvah? How do you conduct yourself in the Beis HaKnesses? These should be images seared onto the heart of the children. Ultimately, this is the biggest impact we will have on our children. I remember about, 7, 8, 9 years ago, I had the privilege to speak in a community in the South, in Memphis, Tennessee. So, it's right off the Mississippi River. You could go to the Bass Pro Shop. You go up the tallest freestanding elevator in North America. You could look down on the Mississippi River, and you could see Huckleberry Finn sailing on a little... One of the highlights of my trip, I met an elderly Yid. He must have been in his 90s. His name was Yehoshua Kutner, which that name alone shocked me because my grandfather was a Talmud Rabbi Shulam Mikutna, and my great-great-grandfather was a Talmud Rabbi Shulam Mikutna, and this old Yid in Memphis was named after him, and he told me one of the most powerful stories I ever heard. He was born in 1920. His father came from Warsaw. His mother came from Galicia. They were in New York in the Great Depression. His parents were so poor that at age 13 years old, he had to support his parents, so he would go to the ice cream store, cover it with dry ice, carry it on his shoulders, go to Lincoln Terrace Park where the trucks were parked at red lights. He would sell ice cream to the truck drivers. At the end of the day, standing outside in the blazing heat, he would put together $1. $1 was like a week's salary in the times of the Great Depression, and he would bring it home. He said, we were poor, but our Rabbeim in Yeshiva Chai in Berlin were much poorer. They couldn't put food on the table. The wealthiest people owned big businesses, had no money, had no business to do. They sold buttons, apples, shoelaces, just to buy food. A quart of milk, 5 cents. Loaf of bread, 2 cents. The New York Times, 1 cent, which is basically what it's worth. One day, the principal of Yeshiva Chai in Berlin called me into the office. He said, your father owes $6 for tuition. The Rabbeim went on strike. If you don't come back tomorrow with $6, you can't come back. Many, many boys were sent home from yeshiva. They went to public school, and they were all lost forever. Make no mistake about the critical importance of yeshiva education. Not the most important thing, the only thing you could do to raise a Jewish family in today's age is the yeshiva system. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have silver candlesticks to sell. My mother didn't have a diamond ring to sell. My father owned one bad suit, one ugly suit that the jacket matched the pants. Mom said, take it to the pawn shop. Maybe you could get $6 and you could put the kids back in yeshiva. Dad went to the pawn shop. He showed the guy the suit. The guy said, it's a piece of junk. He said, give me $6 for the suit. The guy says, worth $3.30. Ultimately, the pawn owner gave Dad $6. Dad gave me the $6. And he put us back in yeshiva. This was one of the most moving experiences in my life. Now me and my brothers understood what Torah meant. Most others were not as fortunate. Had we gone in a slightly different direction, we wouldn't have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who are even Jewish today. My father never had money to buy his suit back. But he got something back instead. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave him 5 generations of Torah-observant Jews. Aaron HaKohen wore 8 Bigdei Kahuna. A regular Kohen wore 4 priestly garments. Our family also had Bigdei Kahuna. My father sold it for $6. It was the best $6 we ever spent. The choices, the decisions we make reverberate beyond today, reverberate beyond our lifetime. The decisions that we're going to make today in what kind of house we have, what we bring into our house, what we allow our kids to watch or partake of, they will make a difference for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And if you're here today and you're observant today, that's because for dozens and dozens of generations your ancestors gave up to ensure that you would have Jewish continuity. Are we willing to do the same for our future? The Gemara tells us in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, on Rosh Hashanah, Melech Yoishev al Kisei Din v'Sifrei Chayim v'Sifrei Meisim Psuchim Lefanav. That on Rosh Hashanah, God does not just judge the living, He judges the dead. Why in the world is God judging the dead on Rosh Hashanah? The guy's buried. He's sitting there peacefully in Har Menuchos. He's 6 feet under. He was judged the Rosh Hashanah before he died. He was judged when he died. Why is God judging him every Rosh Hashanah? What could he be doing wrong sitting there being fed to worms? One day he went like that to the guy next to him. Move over, it's a little crowded over here. What could a dead guy be doing wrong already that he's judged on Rosh Hashanah? The Ramon Siman Tov Reish Yud writes that you light a yardside candle on Yom Kippur. Why? Says the Mishnah Berurah to be mechaper for the Mesim. What do you mean mechaper for the Mesim? Mesim don't do anything wrong. The Ramah says in Siman Tov Reish Chaval, do Sfardim say Yizkar? But we Ashkenazim say Yizkar. Why? We need more kapara for the Mesim. Why Ashkenazim need more kapara. But why do Mesim need kapara? In fact, the Ramah writes in the Darkei Moshe, Yom HaKippurim, kapara for the Chayim, kapara for the Mesim. Why do Mesim need kapara? Comes Rabbi Yeshua Heller, he lived from 1814 to 1880, a student of Rabbi David Tevel, who was a student of Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, a student of the Gaon. Here you have a really great guy. His whole life he lived with Yirat Shamayim. He came to shul early. He davened erlach. He was an honest person. He took care of his wife. He took care of his children. He was kind to people. He went up to Shamayim and they gave him a nice spot on the corner, a corner property with Italian cypress trees in the front and the palm trees, the thin ones with nice leaves. It was a nice property in Gan Eden. And then the next year, Rosh Hashanah, gets a knock on the door. He looks to the people, there's an angel there. Shalom Aleichem, what's doing? Rabbi Yid, you're moving. Where am I moving? You're moving to exclusive Gan Eden. So why? Why am I moving? You're getting a promotion. Why do I get a promotion? Because you had 2 children. And look, they also come early to shul. And they're kaveh itim la Torah. And they're raising very observant families. And they're raising honest children and grandchildren. And that's because of you. That's because of your influence. But the guy says, but I already was rewarded last. Yeah, but this is residual income that you didn't have last year. So now you're getting a promotion. And then the following year, they take him and they say, you're moving it? Where am I moving? You're moving to the Hamptons of Gan Eden. Why are you moving to the Hamptons? Because now you have great-grandchildren, and they're sending their kids to yeshiva. And look how they daven, and look how they learn, and look how honest they are, and look at their midos tovos. And that's all because of you. So this tzaddik is yelchu mechayil el chayil. He's going from one level to another. And just because he passed away, he's just getting going. He's just first collecting his income. And then there was another guy. And this guy was not so hot. He used to come for part of the tefillah. Part of the tefillah he came. Part of the tefillah he stayed in bed. And he didn't really do mitzvot so properly, and he didn't really treat his wife properly. And after 120, he got, his onshim. They put him in a self-cleaning oven a little bit for a couple hours. And then they gave him some reward. They gave him some beat-down apartment in the Lower East Side somewhere, with a bad, ugly lab. There were roaches knocking on his door. But look, he had a place to go. He had a place to spend time. At least he had a bed. The bed was a feather pillow. The feathers were flying out of the pillow. There was mold in the walls. Every hour, the old carbon monoxide alarm kept on going off. But he had a place to sleep. No air conditioning. What are you going to do? Next year, Rosh Hashanah, there's a scary guy looking at him through the peephole. The guy's dressed in red. You're being evicted. Where am I going? You're going to Harlem. Why am I going to Harlem? Well, you spent half the davening in your and the other half in the bed, but your kids, they tried both, and they said the bed is much better. So they're not going at all. So we have to, unfortunately, evict you. You're going to be living in Harlem now. And that's in year 2. And in year 3, they move the guy to the floor of the subway station. Because the trajectory of his family was downward. It says, it told us Yeshua, a person's actions reverberate beyond their lifetime. And then in a footnote, Rabbi Shua Heller says one of the most astounding things. He says, you know that Menashe, in the end of his life, like we mentioned, he did tshuva. But the tshuva of Menashe is only recorded in Sefer Divrei Hayamim. It's not recorded in Sefer Malachim. Why wasn't it recorded in Malachim? So the Divrei Yehoshua quotes a Sefer. He calls it a precious Sefer of Rabbi Avi Ad Sar Shalom, who was a contemporary of the Ramchal, one of the few Gedolim who defended the Ramchal. He wrote a sefer called Emunas Chachamim. And he says on the Pasuk, Gadol ha'etza v'rav ha'aliliya asher einecha pekuchais al kol darchei b'nei adam laseis leish kedracha v'chafrima alalav. That for God to judge one individual, He needs to judge all of mankind. Why does God have to judge all of mankind to judge one individual? Says Rabbi Avi Ad Sar Shalom. Because He can't just judge one person. But what I do affects the guy sitting next to me in shul. And that affects the guy behind him. And that affects that person's children. And those children affect their classmates. And their classmates affect other friends they have. Because every single time we do something, it actually reverberates throughout the entire world. And for God to judge any individual, He has to scan the entire world just to judge you. Says Rabbi Viad Sar Shalom, you know why in Sefer Malachim the Torah does not record the tshuva of Menashe? Because in Sefer Malachim Menashe cannot do tshuva. Because so long as the first Beis HaMikdash was standing, it's very nice. Menashe said, I'm sorry, I bow down to idols. Very nice, but the rest of the Jewish people were still bowing down to idols. So Menashe could try to do tshuva, but he can't really repent because his actions are still reverberating around Klal Yisrael. But says the Divrei Yehoshua in Divrei Hayamim, that was after the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and all the idolaters were killed. And now Menashe's actions finished their reverberations. And then and only then can his tshuva be accepted, and that's why Menashe's tshuva is recorded in Divrei Hayamim and not Malachim. Furthermore, says the Divrei Yehoshua, Malachim was written by Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah was alive during Bayis Rishon. When Yirmiyah is alive, there's still the ramifications of Menashe's Avodah Zarah. But Divrei Hayamim was written by Ezra. In times of Ezra already, Avodah Zarah was nullified. They davened that Avodah Zarah should end, and now finally Menashe's tshuva could be accepted. Says the Gemara in Chagiga, whenever Rabbi Eliezer would come to the following pasuk, he would cry, Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul, Lama hirgaz tani lahalo soisi. Shmuel said to Shaul, why did you wake me up? So here's the story. Shmuel was dead. He was buried. Nabi Samuel. Shaul was stuck. Shaul was between a rock and a hard place. The Philistines were advancing. Shaul had already killed all the diviners, all the necromancers. He had no one to communicate with. The Urim V'Tumim wasn't answering him. He didn't know what to do. He had no choice, he felt. He woke up Shmuel from the dead. And the Gemara says when Shmuel was woken from the dead, he was so scared. He thought that God was summoning him for the judgment of Rosh Hashanah. And he got scared, he got terrified. What was Shmuel afraid of? So what, it's Rosh Hashanah. He made it through all the Rosh Hashanah of his life. He made it through the Yom HaDin when he died. Why would he be scared about a Rosh Hashanah after he died already? It says Meshach Chachma because the pasuk says V'loi halchu banav bidrachav, because his children didn't follow his ways. And therefore he was scared that even though he made it through last Rosh Hashanah, but is he going to make it through this Rosh Hashanah? And the Meshach Chachma explains that's why the Gemara says he summoned Moshe Rabbeinu to his aid, because the Gemara says there's a contradiction between the first 4 books and Devarim. In the first 4 books it says, Poiked avoin avois albanim, that God will punish a parent for a child. But what if it's not the parent's fault? So in Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if it's not the parents' fault, you can't hold them accountable. Lo yumsu avois albanim, and the Medrash says, God says, you know what, Moshe, you're right about that. If it's not the parents' fault, then we're not going to hold the parents accountable. So Shmuel needed to summon Moshe to defend him, to say, this man Shmuel did everything in his capacity, and whatever his kids did, it wasn't his fault, and he did his best. It says, Moshe Feinstein, Elul, es levavcha v'es levav zarecha. Don't sit in shul and klap al chet, and I'm a big tzaddik, and let my kids do whatever they want. Tshuva. More than yourself, worry about your future. It's not as levavcha only. What about levav zarecha? That's Elul, that's Rosh Hashanah, that's Yom Kippur. You could deal with your own repertoire, but the eternal repertoire. So I mentioned my mother's father grew up at a time that assimilation was rampant. I'm talking about Ein Bayis Asher Ein Shames. Okay? You grew up in America in the 1930s. The parents could have come from Hasidish background, any background. The kids on the streets, the parents spoke one language. The kids are in public school, no yeshivas. Ein Bayis Asher Ein Sham, at least one mess. Ein Bayis. We say Ein Bayis is not like almost. That was the reality. But my grandfather had a grandfather. He was a spirited Jew. What did he do? He would prepare for Shabbos. He would shine his shoes for Shabbos until he was sweating. He would be ready for Shabbos well in advance so that he was wearing his best in advance preparation for Shabbos. And then he would sing Ka Riboin Olam. And when he would sing Ka Riboin, the roof would shake. And the Hislahavus of my grandfather's grandfather, I don't know that he was a renowned Torah sage. He was a regular working person with great fervor for Shabbos. And when he would sing Zmiros, you could feel it in your bones. And that Hislahavus entered my grandfather's bones, and that kept him as an Er L'Chayid. My grandfather's name was Meshulam Feish, and I could just imagine every Rosh Hashanah, they knock on Meshulam Feish's door, and they say, you're getting a promotion. I haven't been around in 60 years, 70 years. What did I do? No, it's the same curry bun that we came to you about last year. So you have a great-great-grandson, Glatstein. He has kids. They daven pretty nicely. But that's because of you 70 years earlier. So you're getting a promotion. And if I have a little bit of Yiras Shamayim, it's because that I would go every Erev Yom Kippur to get a bracha from my grandfather, and he would put his hands on my head, and he would put a white cloth on my head, I still don't know why, and he'd put his hands on my head, and he would cry bitter tears. Wasn't a rabbi. He worked on Wall Street. He was a righteous, holy Jew. He would cry bitter tears that I should have Yiras Shamayim and Avas HaTorah. Says Rabbi Yeshua Heller, Al Zois Yecharad Levav Ha'adam. For this, one's heart should tremble. Besitoy Alibai, when we think about. Kol Hamasim Sha'asa Tachas HaShemesh. All the actions that we do in this world, Yivlu Oisai, will outlive you. The way you daven today, we won't be around forever, but the way you daven today will be around forever. Because it affected the person next to you and the guy behind you and your family and your community and all of Klal Yisrael. L'an hein noitim, think about, in what direction are your actions? Imparim yu kodesh ulam Hashem. Are they fruitful? Then they will be holy forever. But im chamas taninim yenam, but if they're bitter, don't think, okay, I did an avera, so I'll give an accounting for it. No. You're going to give a din v'cheshen, al peroi sehen, v'al peroi sehen. Midar, lidar, lidar, lidar. V'yata ben adam, b'yoischa b'chayim chiyascha, and man, while you're still alive, ten libcha v'daitcha, liyos royas hanoilad. Don't be blind, you have to look into the future. Are you going to want to have to run around to everyone in the world and say, no, don't pay attention to my life, ignore my life? You want to have to track down every single person that your actions had ramifications on? Says Rabbi Yeshua Heller, what you do in this world makes a difference. What you do today makes a big difference. What you'll do tomorrow makes a big difference. Life counts. Life's not a joke. Life is important. So what are you going to do for the future of the Jewish people? You could do a lot. Start with your children. Start with the guy sitting next to you in shul. Start with your neighbor. Because your actions reverberate beyond your lifetime. What you do, how you act, the decisions you make will make a difference forever and ever. Aksiva chsima taima.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.